When we first began to ask who would be the best person, the best entity to provide the facts and the data describing where foster care in California is today, one name and one entity was mentioned every time. As the principal investigator of the California Child Welfare Indicators Project, which is funded by the California State Department of Social Services and the Stuart Foundation, Dr. Barbara Needell has worked extensively with statewide and county-specific foster care data. Dr. Needell and her team at UC Berkeley collaborate with state and county colleagues to produce and disseminate the data used to support California child welfare outcomes and the whole system of accountability. She's a member of the California Child Welfare Council and is the recipient of the Peter Forsyth Award for Leadership in Public Child Welfare. When you look for someone to present the facts and the data, to tell us where we are today in terms of foster care in California, the very best person is Dr. Barbara Needell. Dr. Needell?
Good morning, everyone. So it's fitting, following this sister, to mention a quote from Edward Deming, "In God we trust, all others must bring data," which is why I'm here. Let's get going. I have a lot crammed into a relatively short time. I did not realize that the monitors are going to be this small. The PowerPoint will be available to you online as soon as the conference is over, both through Grace and through our website at the school. So you can get any details that you miss, you're welcome to look at later, and then contact me if you have any questions. Now, some of you that have heard me speak before are saying, "Oh no, not the wheel again." I won't spend a lot of time on it today, but I do like to start out with this wheel because it does remind us of two important issues when it comes to data. One is that the kind of data that I'll be talking about today comes from statewide administrative data, which means it's population, it's not a sample, it's data on all of the children and families, and that's great, but it does have its limitations. It tells us how many, how long, where, when, but very little about why. And why is a very important question. We have to look to other ways to research and explore to fully understand the why connected with the data and the outcomes that we look at. And the other point is that it's not a good idea to look at any particular measure in isolation because they're all related to each other. We're very concerned about reunification in California. We have a panel that's going to focus on prevention and reunification. But if you were to just look at a measure of reunification, it could be very misleading because to fully understand it, you would want to explore the rate of children coming into care and reentry after reunification. If a lot of children are coming into care in a jurisdiction, perhaps unnecessarily, it might be easy to get them home and their reunification rate would look great, but instead they might want to focus on why a lot of children are coming into care and going home within a week. And on the other side, reunification is our primary permanency goal, but we want children to go home and stay home. And if a substantial number of them turn around and come back into care, then that's not so great either. This is true of all of the kind of measures we look at. So as much as I think this administrative data is important, these are just warnings to keep in mind that when you look at outcomes, you really should start at the beginning from who's getting reported and look at the entire constellation of measures throughout the system. We'll start with the rates of children who are reported. We call it the allegation rate. The substantiation rate, that's after an investigation, the rate of victims, and then the entry rate into foster care. We compute rates per thousand based on the underlying population. because our population does change over time, and knowing how many children are reported or are found to be victims is useful in terms of case management and staffing, but it doesn't tell us what we need to know in terms of the likelihood of a child being reported or being found to be a victim or coming into care. So we can see that with the most recent data, we see 53 per 1,000 children in California are reported for abuse, and that rate has gone up slightly over the past 12 years. 9 per 1,000 children are found to be victims, and that rate has gone down a bit in the past 12 years. And also the entry rate into foster care is now at 3.4 per 1,000, has also gone down a little bit. Whereas in 2000, the victim rate was 24% of the reporting rate. It's now 17% of the reporting rate. So a smaller proportion of the children controlling for the population who are reported are now found to be victims than they had been over time. Here we're looking at the number of children in foster care, a number that we hear a lot about. The blue line on the top, we see that in the past 12 years, our foster care caseload has declined from over 100,000, 105,000, down to just above 50,000, an enormous decrease in our foster care caseload. When it comes to outcomes, the foster care caseload point-in-time number, as important as it is not a decision point. What are decision points are entries and exits, and the number of children in care on any given day is driven by those two very different sets of dynamics, who we're bringing in and who is leaving. And over any period of time, if there are more exits than there are entries, the foster care caseload will go down. And that's what's been happening for the most part in California over the past 12 years. Every year, or most years, there are more exits than entries. The caseload's been going down. It's not that either entries or exits have changed substantially over time, and you can see that in the graph. Those two bottom lines, the green one are exits, the red one are entries. Those are pretty flat, except for that, you see that bump back in about 2000, 2001 in exits? Anybody want to guess what that was? Kin gap. That was when we implemented the California Kinship Guardianship Program, and we had an enormous backlog of children in the system who were eligible, and they exited. So that's what that bump is. And for the rest, until very recently, entries and exits have been rather flat. Very recently, we have seen our caseload drop stop. The caseload is now flat in very recent quarters and may even be inching up a little bit. When we have noticed also in recent quarters a decrease in the number of children exiting care, that green line starting to dip. In California, our cases are put into what are called service components. Emergency response is the case is open, but there is still some of the investigation process going on. We have the family maintenance component, which are in-home. The child is under custody of the state or county, but the child is in-home, and on this graph we've divided that into being in-home as an attempt to prevent placement, pre-placement, and in-home after placement, post-reunification services. There's family reunification, where the child has been removed, but there are reunification efforts going on to send the child home. And then permanent placement, where the child's in foster care, there are no longer reunification efforts going on for the most part, and hopefully there's another permanency goal, adoption or guardianship, and then for some children, they're in care until they age out. What's interesting about this graph, at least to somebody like me, it's interesting, is that all of those components have been relatively flat over time, except for the permanent placement one. So that enormous drop that we've seen in foster care over time is driven, we see that reflected in a decrease of the number of children in what we used to call long-term foster care. In foster care, no longer on a reunification track. Placement type. There is a focus on one of the panels on congregate care today, so we thought we'd throw in a slide about placement type. This looks over time at the different placement types children are in a point in time. The top bar, the primary use placement type is kin care in California, and the number of children placed with kin has declined somewhat over time, but it really parallels the decline in the overall caseload. We've seen a recent increase in the use of kin care. The use of county supervised foster care, that's the orange line, has gone down. We struggle to find county-based placements, and they are used less and less frequently. In recent years, it has flattened out, but you'll see a gradual decline. Foster family agencies decline, a slight decline, and then germane to the panel discussion today, the blue line is the group care and shelter line, relatively flat with a decline reflective of the overall caseload over time. But none of those lines, FFAs and group shelter, neither of those lines have declined all that much over time, given the enormous decline in the foster care caseload. There's always a lot of interest in race, ethnicity, racial disparities, and so every time we present, we want to at least have a few slides that bring us up to date, up to speed on where we are with that. These are the children in foster care by race. Latinos are the most likely group to be in foster care by race, by quite a bit, as you can see. Black and white children, so Latinos, for people who can't see, the green line are Latino children, the blue line, black children, the white line, white children. White children and black children are in the system in very similar numbers. There was a point a few years ago where the numbers actually crossed, but there's been a widening gap between the number of Latino children in the system and the number of black and white children. This is not an issue of racial disparity, but this is an issue, a very important issue, in the number of children we are serving and how they break out by race, that the majority of the children that we now serve are Latino. Asian and Pacific Islanders are there, they're on the bottom, they are both in the system in relatively small numbers. But now we're going to look at another graph by race. We're going to look at rates. So again, going back to what we did earlier, rates per thousand given the underlying population. Look at these same groups in care by race, rates per thousand given the underlying population by race. And we see a very different picture. The black children are much more likely, given their presence in the population, to be in care than other children. Native Americans are next, and then Latinos and whites are in care at very similar rates. Those rates have gone down just a little bit over time. Asian and Pacific Islanders are much less likely to be in care. The good news about the black rate, even though it is still higher than the rate for any other children, is that you can see that that has also experienced a substantial drop. So while the disparity is the difference between these rates, and while we still see disparity with black children being more likely to be in care, that rate has been coming down over time. This is an awful lot of lines for a big room where people don't have access to the screen, so let's see. The solid lines, we're looking at something important when it comes to reunification, is why we put it up here, and that is the distance. This is looking at children who entered care, who are still in care after 12 months, where they are, how far away they are when they're in care, how far they are from the place they were removed. The solid lines are children who are within 5 miles of their removal, of their home. And the dotted line is more than 10 miles. The blue is kinship care, and the orange is non-kin care. So we got a couple of different things going on here. But what we see is if children are placed with kin, that's the highest line, they are more likely to be close to home, that about 61% of the children placed with kin are less than 5 miles from home, and about 30%, half of those are less than a mile from home. There's more detail about this on our website. And children who are placed with kin, only 28% of them are more than 10 miles from home. Looking at children placed with non-kin, there are, in most years, more children placed more than 10 miles from home than there are children placed less than 5 miles from home. So it is much less likely to be placed close to your removal if you're placed with non-kin. In the latest numbers, 39% of children placed with non-kin are less than 5 miles from home, and 44% are more than 10 miles from home. Placing our children with siblings, we often remove children not alone, but as members of sibling groups, and we can look with the data on how we're doing in placing children together with some of their siblings or all of their siblings. That ability has improved over time. Those lines are both going up over time, flattening out just lately, and we're currently able to place almost 3/4 of the children who come into care with siblings with at least some of their siblings, and over half of children who are in care with all of their siblings. And this is a little bit of a messy, complicated graph, but we look at children who entered care, and depending on when they entered care, take that data and follow them as long as we can. So for children who entered 12 years ago, we can follow them for 12 years, and for children who entered 1 year ago, follow them for a year, and see what that data tells us, displayed that way, about the different routes to permanency and how long they take. The curves, the trajectories, are different for the 3 permanency goals for reunification, adoption, and guardianship, as you can see. And you can see that children who are reunified, we're looking at the percent reunified, that's are the most children who exit to permanency, exit to reunification, but that if it's going to happen, it tends to happen in the first 2 years. A lot of children go home within 3 months or 6 months of coming into care, and after 2 years, although we still do have some reunifications, they become quite a bit less likely. That reunification happens, a lot happens. Within 1 year, there is a measure, a federally mandated goal to look at permanency within 1 year. We can see that reunifications continue to happen beyond 1 year, but after 2 years, they slow down a great deal. Very different story for adoption, where adoption continues to, the proportion of children who entered care that exit to adoption continues to grow all the way up to about 6 or 7 years before it flattens out. And then I believe this is the last slide from these slides are all taken from our publicly available website. And if you've never been there, the URL will be posted at the end. I have cards with the URL on there, but all of these slides are backed up by a tremendous amount of detail breakouts possible, looked at in many different ways in graphs. And so this is just designed to give a little bit of taste in a little tiny bit of time about what the data looks like in California. We're very proud about our ability to have our data posted and publicly available for everyone to see in our system. Many states still struggle with that and haven't learned with what we've learned about the importance of publicly available data if we want to do this work and do it right. Reentry. We looked at reunification, and reunification, again, is a success, but we'd like children to go home and stay home. And another federally mandated measure is that orange one of the children who go home, what percent come back within a year. And we can see that currently about 11-12% of children do reenter care within a year. That number's decreased a bit in recent year. We also have the ability to look longer than a year, and this is important. Sometimes we can even put in place those post-placement reunification services, in-home services after reunification, but they are often time-limited, sometimes last just a year. So we see other children reenter outside of that one-year window, and if we were to follow children 2 years after reunification, about 16 or 17% of them are currently coming back into care. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk as much as I'd like to about this section. We're very happy that the organizers put the article that has kicked off this work that we're doing at Berkeley in your folder, and hopefully you'll have a time to read it. My colleague, Emily Putnam-Hornstein, is here, and she is the lead in this fantastic work, and it is about data linkage and what we can learn when we link up this child welfare data that we have access to with other data in the system. This, in particular, links up to birth records. We've been able to link up so look at all the children who are born in California and ask questions like, of all the children born in California, how many of them have contact with our system by the time they're 5 years old? That's what this first article looks at. There are articles since then, a lot of work going on, and this is just a taste of what's available to us with data that we have right now for all of our children. Just a few of the selected findings from this data linkage between children born in California and children who have contact with our system by the age of 5. 14% of children are reported by the age of 5, and this is an underestimate because possible some flaws in our ability to link all of the records. Of that 14%, about a third of those were reported as infants, and 25% of them were reported within the first 3 days of life. There are about a dozen variables on the birth record. Who knew? There's a lot of information on there, and we were able to get all of these variables on the birth record, and it turned out that 11 of 12 of them were statistically significantly associated with CPS contact. The only one that wasn't was the gender, sex or gender of the child. And in fact, 7 of them were strongly associated with CPS contact. Also, this linkage has told us that although we often think of foster care as a rare event, it is hardly rare for certain groups of children. 30% of Black children are reported to our system by the time they're 5 years old. 30%. A quarter of children born to teen mothers are reported to our system by the time they're 5. And then very quickly, this is just a list of the kind of records that we have, kind of information that we have on the birth records, and we're able to take a lot of them and consider them, at least in theory, modifiable. So setting aside sex and race and birthplace of the mother, these other variables like when prenatal care started, the age of the mother, education of the mother. Those are all things that could possibly be modified over time. So we did a couple of very, very back-of-the-envelope computations to show the power. The point is to show the power of using data sources like this to understand, to predict and understand what may be going on in our system. So looking at variables and looking at the ones that have the strongest relationship with coming into our system, we are calling any birth with 3 or more risk factors high risk. And this first slide that I'm going to show you. And what does that look like? If we call any 3 or more of those modifiable risk factors high risk, that accounts for 15% of the children born in California. But it accounts for half of the children who are reported to our system. So that's one way it's obvious, the power of data, with data that's readily available to us. Now, of course, we're not talking about going in and mandating services at birth to anybody, but if we don't have enough money to serve everyone, the data, available data, gives us a good idea of who we might target because of who is most likely to be reported for maltreatment to our system by the time they're 5 years old. And one more look, and this takes those risk factors and makes the point that 1 or 2 of them does not necessarily put a child at high risk of coming into the system, but the effect is cumulative. A birth where none of the risk factors are present has a 3% chance of being reported by the time the child is 5. A child who's high risk on all of the factors has an 89% chance of being reported. So much more to come on this. And look forward to this rather new and very, very important way for us to share and use the data linkage for what's predictive risk modeling and understanding with available data how we might target our resources. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That's great. Okay, let me scoot over here. Thank you, Dr. Needell. Dr. Needell's presentation will be available on the GRACE website, www.grace-inc.org. So it'll be up beginning tomorrow.